Welcome to the Level Design Podcast. In this episode, we ride through the dunes, canyons, and the ups and downs of the wonderful game called Sable with Gregorios Kythreotis from Shedworks. Let's get on with the show. Hello, welcome to this show, and hopefully I haven't butchered your name, Greg. I tried to get it right.
I think it's better than what I can pronounce it, so we won't bother too much.
One thing, I lost a tooth a couple of weeks ago, so like my thirds are very thirty, so I apologize.
We'll put it down to that, don't worry. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah.
So I apologize to the listeners if I suddenly sound a lot like the cat in one of those Warner Brothers cartoons, but yeah, thank you for joining us. We had to postpone the recording of those episodes, so it'll probably come out late due to me catching COVID. Finally, after 2 years, it caught up with me. So that's what the dulcet tones in this episode are going to be of me recovering from a cold. Also joining me is Valentina Chrysostomou. Welcome to the show, Valentina.
Hello, it's nice to be here again. Yeah.
And in this show, we're going to talk about a wonderful. I've got to say, I've been looking at Sable for years, for the development of Sable. You've marketed it amazingly on Twitter with just having to do those little GIFs. It was just beautiful watching to see the sand bike or just going through. But before I get too much into like gushing over the game, do you describe what the game is for people that haven't seen it?
Yeah, so Sable is a open world desert exploration game. It's a non-violent game, so you don't have any combat or survival mechanics. There's no kind of danger to the player in terms of you can't die or anything like that. But the game follows the story of this young girl, Sable, who's part of this kind of nomadic clan, and she's leaving home for the first time on a kind of tradition, a rite of passage that they have as a community, and it's called the gliding. And on this gliding, people in this world, basically everyone does this. They go out, and everyone in this world wears a mask, and on the gliding they try on different masks before, at the end of the gliding, choosing what mask they want to settle on. And so throughout her adventure, Sable is trying on these different masks, and masks confer different meaning and function, and they kind of can be oriented around professions or specific cultural elements or events. And yeah, so it's just her going through the world, discovering this place, discovering the people in it, and discovering herself basically, and becoming an adult. So that's where we follow Sable, and we always thought of it as kind of like a gap year or like a room springer type thing, where
I like that idea of the gap year year in the desert.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and so it's saying that there's and it's kind of sci-fi setting, so you're riding around on a hover bike and you're gliding around with this kind of ancient ability called the Perpetual, which lets you like glide through the air, and we have like a free climbing system, and yeah, so it's narrative focused, but first and foremost it's exploration focused, and we just we oriented all of the design philosophy around creating a exploration focused experience for the player, really. Yeah, we do stuff where we try and make it so the player has a lot of choice when they finish the game, and where they go. So the only things we require the player to do in the game is the tutorial, start the game, leave home, and end the game. Everything else is a side quest, basically. Yeah,
isn't life? That's life, isn't it? Everything else is a side quest,
Oh God. Yeah.
The metaphors compound. But some of the things I think that, as well as that, I think one of the things that really drew me, was the visuals of Sable. You've pinned down an art style that I've been a massive fan of, which is of the artist Mobius. Maybe we can't, copyright reasons or whatever. It's an art style. You can't, copyright that. But it's got a very comic-y I know people want to call it cell shaded. I don't think it's cell shaded, but it,
yeah, I don't. We always kind of called it clear line style because that's that's the style of the kind of Belgian and French comic artists, and you know, it kind of one of the progenitors of that was Herd, or like Tintin, and then Mobius kind of continued that tradition, and you had like Francois Chaton and numerous other artists, really. But yeah, Mobius is a strong touchstone for us, a big inspiration, really. I think especially, you know, our work gets associated with his a lot because a lot of his work was set in the desert and in has these kind of hover bike type things. But I think it's kind of circular. It's quite strange because really we were initially inspired by Star Wars, The Force Awakens specifically. And if you look back at the like lineage of Star Wars and the heritage of the concept, you can kind of trace it back to Jodorowsky's Dune, where George Lucas was working on that with Mobius, who was doing the concept work for that, and that fed into Star Wars, and so it becomes this circular thing. And so, you know, and then the other influences, I'd say we have the influences really strongly with like Ghibli, like Studio Ghibli work, Nausicaa, and Mononoke, and again, Mobius and Miyazaki were good friends, and you know, like they had influence on each other. So it's this kind of circular history in a way that developed over time. I mean, yeah, you can trace the lineage from a lot of places. It's the obvious connection, I think, to a lot of people. But I think actually, like from an emotional standpoint, I put Ghibli more up there as an influence for me personally, just in terms of tone, in terms of atmosphere, but also just before we started the project, I'd just been in Japan, I've been in Tokyo, and I went to the Ghibli Museum as part of that trip, and it was just like, it was literally just before we started, and I just felt like, yeah, the place I was in my life at the time, I just had two family members die like very, very close to one another, and work was kind of plateauing a little bit, and we weren't really doing projects that were right for us. And I guess it kind of like felt like a bit of a inspirational moment where it was just like, okay, like from this, like, what do I really want to do, and what do we really want to do as a studio? And actually we started another project and we submitted it to Stugan, and it was like this kind of co-op raft building game, like and it wasn't really what we were going to do. And I just remember we submitted it, and I said to Daniel, like a week later, we were just sat in the shed when we were working in my parents' shed, and I turned to Daniel and I said, do you really want to make this game? Like, would you rather not make Sable? Because we've been talking about Sable for a year up at that point. I was just like, should we just make Sable? Like, we don't think it'll make any money, and we don't think people will be interested in it, but we really like it and we think it's cool. And at least this way, we've done one thing we really care about, and we can just fuck off. Like, we can just, I'll just go back to studying architecture. And Daniel, he was a freelance programmer at that point. He'd probably have continued working in games, but I probably would not have. I probably would have just moved back into architecture. So yeah, so Sable was the kind of like Hail Mary project for us as a company, short of freelance work and contract work.
That's a big jump. I mean, I think it's absolutely commendable to actually do the I don't want to say a passion project as in something that can't happen, but doing something that you really care about rather than something that you think, oh, well, this I'm in it for the money because this will sell, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, we built up a little bit of money, not much, but maybe enough for like 3 or 4 months, maybe a bit more, just to work on this. And we thought to ourselves, this will be a really short project that we just get out there and like we find exciting. And then we started to share stuff from it about a week into development. And this was stuff we'd kind of been, like I said, thinking about and developing actually conceptually for about a year before, but in our free time or when we had a week here and there between contracts. And actually we had failed a pitch to the UK Games Fund just prior to that. But yeah, we showed it and it kind of started to pick up on Twitter, and it was like, okay, it's kind of interesting. And then the next GIF was like even bigger, and the next one was even bigger, and they were getting articles written about the GIFs, and it was like, okay, people care about this, they're interested. You know, you go from like, I don't know, 500 followers to like, I don't know, a couple thousand in like a couple weeks, and you're like, okay, like this is much bigger than anything we've done before. Maybe there's something here. And then publishers start getting in touch, and yeah, it kind of ramped up. But it was also more than a passion project as well. It was a project that played to our strengths as a team. Prior to this, we'd actually been working on smaller mobile projects, like puzzle type games, but I had studied architecture, and we hadn't done a single game with a building in it up to that point.
I mean, to be fair, the Swing King and the Temple of Bling is inside a building, but not.
That's true.
You know.
Yeah. That was, yeah, I mean, it was, but it was very level design focused, and it was pixel art, which I had no experience in, and I was just kind of doing, and it was, and Daniel's background was in comparative literature, and we both love, but he particularly loved narrative. Like, we really want to make a narrative focused project, and we had not made a video game with a single word in it up to that point. So so this was actually a project that really played to our strengths, and we just continued with that. And that was
when you started with Sable. You mentioned you were inspired from it, and you started working on it just from the background. So what did that look like? Did the art inspire the open world design, or did you want to make a narrative game first and then that inspired the art? What started first?
So the first thing was the concept, just the kind of the idea from like The Force Awakens of just being this desert with these giant spaceships, ruined ships, and you're just someone living on this planet looting these ships. And like the initial concept was actually going to be a lot smaller, and it was just going to be more like a loop where you're kind of like, you've got a base and you're selling loot that you're getting from a big ship, and you're just gradually exploring this big ship, and you're selling the loot, and you're getting maybe better gear to explore the same ship a bit further, and you go deeper and deeper or whatever. But it was meant to just be really as small as possible. That was literally the first idea. But then I'd say like a week later, we started working on this prototype. 2 hours. We're going to the pub, to the London Indies pub night, and we're like, okay, we got 2 hours, like why don't we just knock up a little prototype? And we bought a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer like sand dune asset from the asset store, and a €5 hover car asset, not even a hover bike. And we pulled in some post effects from another project. So I'd been trying to like replicate an architectural drawing style in another project, like a black and white architectural drawing style. So I had all this like post effect rendering stuff that we brought over, and all you could do, and I put a giant cube 2 kilometers away, and the giant cube was half a kilometer inside. And all you could do was take this hover car and drive across this landscape to the giant cube, and we add some colors, and it was, yeah. And then we took it to the pub, and people were really into it. People were just like, yeah, this is compelling, in a way that, like, you know, we've been working on other games for like 6 months and showing it to them, and it's a real, like, they're playing it out of courtesy, or they're playing it because they want me to play their game and give them feedback. Whereas this was like, we just put a laptop in the corner, and people were gathering around it like, oh yeah, this is cool. And like, first time anyone had ever like recorded it off screen and be like tweeting about it or whatever. And you're just like, this is weird. Like, there's something maybe here. And so then the idea kind of developed from that. Like, I think it was more initially going to be more of a like environmental narrative, maybe less writing and more just like, you're a character exploring a desert, and again, really small scope, just like ruins. And it was just like, okay, that's the sort of thing that on the art side I can produce easily, and on the programming side Daniel can program like feasibly, and then we'll figure out animation. Maybe I'll have to do some stuff and Daniel will have to do some whatever. And then it just, yeah, like I said, it snowballed from there. Like the visual stuff, the initial passes we had were kind of like developing the style, but they weren't really, they didn't have like a technical foundation to them. And then Daniel had a shot. This is what I meant by, so we've been thinking and talking about this stuff for a while. We had concept art, and then Daniel had just like a week to work on the shader for it. And I think the work on the shader was just unbelievable. Like, it was just, he was really determined to make it look consistent. And I mean that from a like, so one of the most difficult things with the outlines was like stairs or steps, and getting them to reliably render. And he had made a system where you could get that working really reliably, like really stably. And I think those sorts of things start to layer up, and we start to add like new just layers to it. And it was super stable. It was just like, this is really consistent. There's no weird, like, when you rotate this, it looks 3D.
Sable was stable.
Sable was stable. Yeah.
The stairs in Sable were stable. That's
Yeah.
And is that
Yeah.
when you first started posting on Twitter after you got the shader working? Or was it even
Yeah,
before
that was, yeah, exactly. And actually, I was probably a bit hesitant about that, but I think Daniel just shared a tech thing with the like basic character, and it did well. And then we started sharing a bit more, and it was like, oh, okay, this is doing pretty well. But we were still kind of like a bit coy about what it was. And I think for a long time, people were like, oh, is this a racing game? Is this a, what is it? They didn't know. And we were really wary about just saying it too much about it, because we needed to lock down what it was exactly. And I think that's just something we carried on throughout. And I think eventually we folded it into, so the game is all about mystery. It's all about like uncovering things, obscuring things, revealing things.
There's a lot of one of the, sorry, going back before we go to the context of the game. This is a reality of a lot of games. They have to be fluid. You have to have a concept of what you want to do, for sure. But sometimes you do something and goes, oh wow, okay, that's really cool. That's the game, right? And if you're showing stuff right at the beginning and be going like, so what's the ending going to be? It's like, well, I could tell you, but if you've done this enough times, or you've seen enough people do it, you know that, well, maybe it's probably going to be different, but this is what it looks like now, right?
Yeah, like that early stage, you have to be flexible. It's not, you're just making decisions, and you're trying to calculate like what's the cost of this going to be? Is it feasible? What's the kind of, when I say cost, I don't mean like money, even I just mean time. I mean like resources.
What other things are you not going to do in a team of, is Shedworks like 2 people, right?
Yeah, we're just 2 people. I mean, we're back to 2 people now in the office, just Daniel and I, and we had a number of contractors, and we were a bigger team during development of Sable. We're between 6 and 10 at any point, full, like depending on the day really. And then we had people at our publisher as well at some point, who we could not put the game out. It still wasn't like a massive team for an open world game.
I mean, it's an open world game, right? This is like this is like asset insanity, like that you have to create for an open world. And as Val can attest, I'm always like, so when are we making our open world games? And Val's
I mean, the thing I'd say is as well, like, it's difficult to talk about because we were 2 people for a very long time. So we're talking about 4-year development, and for the first year or so, we were, 2 people, maybe 3 on some days, but it was very few people. And then you ramp up, and then the next year you're 4 or 5 people, and then by the end you're 6 or 10. But it doesn't mean it's a full-time 10 people for 4 years or whatever. And that's where it becomes quite a complicated discussion, because sometimes people come in for 1 week or 1 day, and then they're like consulting on something or implementing some really specific, like we had John Ingold come in and do some really specific ink stuff for us, like half a day. But him and Joe made, and Tom made ink, right? And they're like, they know it inside out. So it's those sorts of things that it's like, becomes a complicated discussion, because that's not an extra person on the project development in terms of like resourcing. It's not suddenly a 30-person project because you had one person full time. And so I think the conversation around that stuff's really complicated, actually. And I think we were super wary as well of like it's expectations, but both ways, because you don't want to be disingenuous and be like, this is a 2-person thing the whole time, right? But you say that early on because that is the truth early on, because that's what we had. So when you do the early interviews, you're saying we're a 2-person team, we work in my parents' shed. That is true, and that was true for a long time. I think that was a good
choice as well, because it kind of established the fact that obviously this isn't 1,000 people working on an open world game. You're not going to expect all these crazy maps with objectives, with side quests, with characters, like with animation. So you kind of like, it actually even makes it more interesting. Like there's 2 people working on something that became popular online, and it's an open world game. So you're kind of starting to theorize like what kind of open world game is that gonna be? And I think it becomes more interesting than any other AAA open world game, because you already know what those will be in a way, in a sense, if you know what I mean. But if there's one person working on a small open world game, or like a team of 2, you start to kind of like wonder what new things are going to exist and come out from this game. And that's what made Sable interesting to me. I was like, oh, it's an open world game, such a small team. I want to know what it's going to be about, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. But I don't also just want to be clear that like, it's not a 2-person team project, you know, it isn't anymore. And it, you know, when you say those things at the beginning, then people continue to report that later on. And it's like, it's very hard to be like, yeah, we have more people, but also you got to find that balance, because you also don't want to say to people, we're 10 times bigger now, when you're not really. And also then people get the expectation like you're 10 times more productive, you're 10 times more. And
I mean, I think you're right. This is how you sell it. I think that the sales pitch was as a game of like, oh, it's 2 people, but over a period of time, you know. And I realize in Sable, and I wanted to talk about this in a sec, you don't have voice acting, you don't have like, so what are you going to count all the actors in the game as like people that have been there for like 4 years when they maybe came and did 1 line, which they didn't. But actually, so going back to Sable, like it uses, you've cut down on a massive overhead of difficulty, as Val and I have found out recently, which is having voice acting for the amount of dialogue that you had there, because you've been writing this story as well, so as you go along.
Well, the other thing is the writing came in hot, like production wise, it came in hot. And like we didn't have localization ready, but to launch, and we did get it after. But what that means is like if you've got voice, in a way it forces you to lock things down earlier. But because we could be a bit more like loose, it meant that it came in a bit later, but it also meant that we could come in a bit later with the writing, for example. I mean, a lot of things came in hot, not just the writing, but if you have to run the
it's
writing,
a desert game after all, it has to be hot, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. But no, it's I mean, I think the production, we were really, the best decision we made was being flexible with content. We had the only must-haves were the beginning and end of the game. There were nothing else was must-have, and it meant that you get, you know, a year out or 6 months out, 9 months out, or whatever, and you need to cut stuff, and you can cut half the stuff you have planned, and it makes, you know, the game still can accommodate what you've done.
That's super interesting. Delaney King was saying about having your game loop. In other words, like you should, like as soon as possible, be able to finish the game, because everything else that you added, like here's your core mechanic, here's the beginning, your core mechanic, and the end, and your save, and all of that. Get all that into place in there. And it sounds like you were doing that, but how do you do that in an open world game? I mean, it's in the how Greg, how?
Okay. So that's the flip side. That's the bad decision we made, which was make an open world game, because you can't actually test an open world game. Really, you can't test the experience until you have everything there, because players play how they want to play. That's the whole point. The whole point is, so it's all theory. The whole game is theory, and you're just hoping it comes off. Like I mean, 2 weeks before launch, I have no idea how it's going to be received. No idea. Literally zero. And it's a lot of it is because the structures, the playability actually comes in so late with the type of game we had. And it was like the closest we got to be able to test that was the vertical slice, which was the demo or the tutorial of the game, which is like a kind of microcosm of what the rest of the game is. But it's still much more guided. It's still much more hemmed in. And also we have to use it as a place to teach the player things. So yeah, we didn't know until quite late what the open world experience would actually be. It was just a lot of like theory, a lot of like hoping, I guess. I mean, yeah, they were kind of guesses with calculations made, and that's where references come in really strongly. Like you need to have those other games that you're like, okay, this game or that game have like are interested in this way, and that gives me reassurances on this thing or whatever. Like I think a game really early on that kind of assured us or gave us confidence with the not having combat was Submerged. I think that's what it's called.
Right, yeah.
The one set in the city with all the like the greenery. There's like water, loads of water all over the place.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Is it Submerged? I'll check it out.
I forget the name. Anyway, yeah. So that game, like, I remember we played that, and that was one of the games that kind of like made us feel like, no, there's a compelling thing happening here, and there's no combat, there's no survival mechanics. It's just like seeing something in the distance and going out and exploring it. And that was, we had tested that with our little prototype or whatever, but when you see it executed in a final game and it's taking place over like 3 or 4 hours or whatever, then you're like, okay, no, this can sustain as well. This isn't just a like interesting idea for 20 minutes. It's a video game.
Yeah. Because the prototype kind of works for the 5-10 minutes that you tested. Like riding the bike is a cool mechanic, but riding the bike for 4 hours in an open world game where you have to do other things, is that interesting enough during the whole experience? That's like a different question, right?
Yeah, and so much of it as well, our motivation was like narrative based, and so it's like, again, like the narrative just has to be good, and the world has to be strong, the atmosphere has to be compelling,
and the motivation, right? Because as a player, you can have this big sand pit to drive around in and visit, but you want. I'm thinking back to Death Stranding, Valentina, because
it's your obligation to mention.
It's my obligation to bring that up. And hey, it's an open world episode. I have a legal right to bring it up. But for example, I think at one point you kind of don't run out of things to do, because they're very clever about like having things to do. But if you didn't have any more deliveries to do, and you just had this world with mechanics, with whatever ghosts or enemies in that one, you'd get bored very quickly, I found, but if you have motivations of why you should be seeking the things that you should be doing, you can then also really enjoy that traversal,
Yeah.
But you also had a lot of puzzles in the game. It's not just traversing from place to place, right?
In Sable, you mean? Yeah. We've got a number of puzzles, and then it's also just like exploration puzzles, just like getting up a thing, and like I don't think it's so basic, but it's just like what's really
beautiful
is
there's a lot of animations
cool
and feelings in it, which are really cool. Yeah.
Well, and yeah, we do those little rewards, and we try and have things in place, and I guess it's just like that constant. I think the biggest thing that I've been thinking about since we launched, and thinking about other games that are like really interesting, things like Dark Souls games like Elden Ring or something. It's just the idea of like possibility space for the player. It's just like, what could I experience as a like compelling reason to like continue exploring? And you do have to have things that like surprise the player or excite the player in that way. But I think it's like a magic trick, so much of game development is like a magic trick, right? Like you're just trying to pull tricks on the player, psychological tricks or technical tricks or whatever. and a lot of that is about like the possibility that I could see anything or do anything that like they've surprised me in some way. And I think, yeah, that's where variety comes in. And but you know, there's a lot to be said as well, like just about climbing a tall thing and like seeing a vista, like that's a rewarding thing. And sometimes all you need at the top of that is a little box with a like. And as a designer, like what's in the when I remember playing like Final Fantasy 12 during development, and sometimes you just like look for those side bits, or you go off what you know is like the main path because you're like, oh, there's a chest there or something. And I don't even care what's in the chest. I don't even like think about what's in the chest. Sometimes there's money, sometimes there's a weapon I'm never going to use, whatever. But like it's a thumbs up from the designer. It's like, yep, well done, you found the thing. Like keep going.
I call that the Borderlands toilet.
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah. And I think
sorry for readers for listeners at home, listeners at home. The toilets in Borderlands, if you open it up, generally you'll find a money box inside the toilet for whatever reason, a little safe with money. I mean, I don't care about the money because it's a game full of infinite money essentially, but it's a ka-ching, hey.
Well, that's it. And like Luigi's Mansion did that really well. Where like the money, I don't know what you do with the money in Luigi's Mansion. You just like, but it makes. I feel like if they didn't have the coins in it, the fun things they've actually built, which is like these like pull it, like do this puzzle, this totally optional puzzle, would feel so much less compelling. Like I'd feel much less motivation to do it. But just by being like acknowledging that I did it, it's just like a pat on the head. And I mean, yeah, and if you can turn that into something more compelling, then great. Like we try to use narrative as reward, or use just like visuals, or a cutscene, or like or items like bike parts or clothing. But then what you build into those, which can be compelling, as a world building. So like when you give a piece of an item of clothing, this is like what the Souls games do really well, is like the item description has like some world building in it, and it creates the layering and the depth in the world building as well. And that I think is really rewarding for a lot of players.
It's interesting that they talk about the rewards, and there's just, I think there's just so many different ways to do a reward. Like it doesn't have to be, like you said, something super specific that you need in the game. It's about like, if we take Sable, if you climb something, or if you drive a distance towards a landmark, and because you kind of go through some motions, it's not actually a challenge to drive there, but it's like the player is doing an action, so they expect something at the end of their action, and the harder the action is, the more excited they are to get the reward. So once you get to a landmark, and if that has something to explore inside, and it has a puzzle, that's already a reward to them getting there. Then when you solve the puzzle, you get something else. Maybe it's like even just the view, like you said, the vista, then that's a reward to them, like doing the puzzle. So it's always like this kind of like nice loop to receive something, even like it's the game acknowledging the player's actions. It doesn't have to be necessarily something like super like the most exciting reward ever, but it's just the fact that the game understands that the player did something, and it like kind of rewards them in a way for it. That's already,
it's that conversation with the player, isn't it?
Yeah,
Heated
conversation.
I mean, like Elden Ring, which I'm playing at the moment, I think it's really interesting because their thing is like, wherever you go, the kind of end result of what you're doing, there's always something, and usually it's like a boss or something, like a hard enemy or whatever. But what works about that is it also communicates to the player, you're done here. Like you, and sometimes, you know, as a player, like if I haven't found the boss, there's something more to this place. And that's really interesting because it keeps you, and I think this works really well for them, but it keeps you exploring a place and pushing at the boundaries of it. And sometimes, so like I found this cave and I kept going down it, and I found this like big boss kind of thing, but I knew I couldn't beat it. But then I just kept exploring because it didn't come up with like the boss bar at the bottom. And I found this little kind of crack in the wall and ended up going down there. And then I found this little statue, It's like a summoning statue. I was like, okay, that usually means there's a boss, but this is away from the other boss. And then I kept going, and I found like the most incredible thing I found in the game, just like through this other crack. And it's like, this is so hard to find. This is so obscure. This is such a like secret. And I'm not the sort of player who will really spend thousands of hours on like one game, but if I feel like it's giving me enough, because I don't want to like strike every wall and try and work out every tiny little secret if it's super complicated and esoteric or whatever. But if you give me that little bit of like a kind of nudge, then
there's that little candy, like there's little like there's crumbs that are just saying like just a little bit further compared to the players that like PT. I don't know if you've ever seen the walkthroughs through PT. That I don't know if any of these are real. You have to say a word at a certain point. You have to stand on your head for 3 hours while staring at the game, and the game will stare back at you. All of this sounds like placebo effect type stuff, but
but that's possibility space stuff, I think. And I think Kojima's really good at possibility, like pushing possibility space and just making you feel like sometimes it's just a small detail, like a van slipping, like in Metal Gear Solid 5, like if your horse shits in the road, then a van can like slide on it or whatever. A truck, if it drives over it, and like it's such a small detail, and it can happen incidentally, but when it happens, it makes you wonder like what else could happen. Like, and I think that's exciting.
Hideo Kojima games are really good with that kind of stuff, right? Like you have it's just that basically a ton of mechanics that you wouldn't normally expect. Like you said, if your horse poops, like why would you expect anything from it? But then when something happens, you get surprised, and therefore you're like, oh, what else is there in the game? This is like, that's a great example of like you said, just the possibilities that you can.
I like the definition of possibility space, because until recently I've been using another I have 3 dogs which you can't see at the moment. Normally these sofas are for them, not for humans. And in training dogs, you see people giving them lots of treats. One of the tricks, and I'm getting to the point, I haven't gone completely insane, is not to give them a treat when they think they're going to be, when you're training them, right? Not just when you're giving them a treat. So it becomes more randomized. So when you get one, you can train them a lot quicker because of that random. And that's what the gambling machines in pubs and things like that is, that this possibility space that sometimes it might not happen and sometimes it might. If it always happened, then it's not a possibility space. It's a confirmation space. It just always happens, right?
Exactly.
I see how you mean it.
But also and I mean, it's not like you have that Skinner box kind of design that you talk about, but it's not like super intentional. We just can't fill this world, but it's something that you have to just think about and acknowledge as a designer and work with as a tool, really, in terms of motivation, because so much of level design, particularly game design, architecture, spatial design, is psychology. Is so much of it is like trying to anticipate people and having your own intent and trying to like nudge or encourage people towards those things, or to encourage people to feel certain things. And that's really, really hard to verify. I think that's the thing that so like I think a lot about like indie developers who make roguelike games, and I'm kind of jealous of them because they get to play their own game and it has like a random factor and it can be like interesting to them to play. For me, when I play Sable, I'm bored because I know everything. There's nothing to surprise me. There's nothing. And so there's not even, and it makes making those games really, but what that also means is I get like one chance to test anything with anyone. So a lot of the time, if I was starting a new level, I have to wait to a certain point before I show Daniel even, because I want his first impression, and I want his impression to be of informative, but sometimes, if you show someone something too early, then the information you get back is stuff you know already. It's like, oh, this needs polishing, or this needs, you know, and you're like, that's not useful. It's not, because I know that, you know. So that, and then once I've shown it to him, that's one person down. So when you get a bigger team, you can be like, okay, I've got 3 people here.
And you don't want to do it at the wrong time either, because if you do it, they'll basically know the whole thing, and then you'll go back and tweak something. They're not gonna notice that anymore, that tweak. But that tweak could have saved your life, and they could have given you completely different, like, completely different feedback, basically.
And now we know why you had 10 people, because you just kept on like doing like different levels and going like, right, I had a new person to show that this level to. But
I mean, yeah, we only had 4 of us in house, so everyone else was remote. But yeah,
I'm not going to keep on pushing you about this, like the amount of people working on Sable. It's actually, in all honesty, what I said at the beginning, I was going to gush about Sable. It's a game that I really loved. I love the stillness of it at points, you know, like the fact that you can just sit there and enjoy the environment. You can, you know, the mechanics of them are really lovely. The movement through the environment is really lovely, and of course the art style is something that's wonderful. Also, the dialogue seems to be it's very, I'm going to say this it's very genteel, it's very lovely. I don't know, I keep on saying like lovely and genteel, but it's as someone that's just been sick, and I didn't want, or ill, I should say, not sick, but just, you know, like a lot of games were like too much noise and chaos, and like Sable was kind of like, you know, a nice little,
you know. We tried to make it warm and accommodating as a game, as a world, and I think that feeds it, you know, that fed into like the writing and the narrative, and Kim and David, the writers, did an amazing job on that. I think, you know, I know they put a lot of themselves into the project, and they did really good work. But I think also the music and the sound design, and like Martin and Michelle both push that stuff really hard. And like when you talk about sitting still in the world, one of the things that we were really like conscious of was creating a sense of place. It's something that you talk about all the time when you're studying architecture. Sense of place, sense of place, sense of place. Like, how can you express that? And I think in games it's even more important. I think it's everything basically. And the sound is such a big part of that, because of the art style, because the art style is abstracted and minimalist and stuff. To convey things like materiality requires sound. To convey like so much of the mood requires the music and the cues and the way that's lined up, and the atmosphere. So, you know, it's a toolbox of things, and those things all tie in really nicely, I think. But in terms of the work that everyone else contributed, I think I'm really, really proud of everyone. I think and I think the sound I mean, it is such a fun thing as a level designer, or even as a, you know, environmental designer, when you're pulling that stuff in, when you've just got this silent area, and then like you pull a build like a week later, and suddenly it's got like crickets and like footsteps sound like stone. They don't just sound like whatever generic sound you had before. And it's like, wow,
sound just makes everything better. Like, that's such a huge thing that we don't think about. If you played at night in Sable, for example, and you switch the sound to suddenly be creepy, like a horror music, or whatever, horror vibes, it would immediately make the player think, oh my god, this area, is there something gonna happen, like are there ghosts in here? Like, it will immediately switch that, so you can put whatever sound you want, and suddenly you can make whatever game you want, no matter like what the mechanic is or the visual is. You can trick the players, like you said, it's like tricks. And like this, the music in Sable, like you said, just makes it feel like a warm, even though it's a desert, like and it feels like a bit like I don't know, well, I would not feel it feels, I guess it looks apocalyptic. Like, I wouldn't like roaming in real life there, but just the music and everything, the way it's been done, it just feels heartwarming in a way. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't want to say cozy. It's not I don't think it's like a cozy game, but you do have that warmth that you mentioned.
We like, I think one thing with Sable is we were never consciously trying to be like, this is a wholesome game, or this is something that's always being like positive, or, you know, there's no bad in this world, because I think there is, and there's a weirdness and there's an unsettling. Like one of my favorite things is the like weird unsettling stuff. Like a big game for me growing up was Majora's Mask, and it like it creeped me out. It creeped me out so badly. I loved it. Like I love that. It's so cool. I'd love to do slightly weirder stuff, but the world itself had to accommodate lots of different types of players as well. Like we really wanted to make a game that a lot of different types of gamers could play, and like the puzzles are pretty much all optional. So it's things like having that be optional means that we then don't have to build in like difficulty levels into the game. Instead, it's just like, well, if you don't like this, walk away, don't bother, like just don't do it. And there's lots of other things for you to do, or other play styles for you to explore. And the point is that you almost don't necessarily get on with all of it. And that like, no, I found like, I really love this thing, and that's what I want to take Sable on to do. And that's okay. Of course, a lot of gamers will like always want to do 100% of what's in a game or whatever, but and the game still accommodates that. But in terms of the broader experience, I think that was a big objective of ours, was to have it so that if you didn't want to engage with the puzzle solving, or you found the puzzle too difficult or esoteric, or then you could walk away. And that actually made the playtesting and stuff easier, because it meant that there's no puzzles in the game that we really require the player to do. And so you don't have the whole like, like a lot of Uncharted games, they need you to solve all of those puzzles. So they have to have the chatter, they have to have the hint system, they have to have like, the puzzles have to be play tested to within an inch of their life, because if they're not, then the game will be bad. If you get stuck on a puzzle for like 2 hours, you're just gonna have a bad time.
Well, that's the thing about something linear, right? And I think I read an article in somewhere. Yes, I do read, which was talking about how your design ethos about it was like, well, okay, we can just add new areas, like little islands in the sea, or the sand sea, and if that didn't work, we can just pull it out and like cut scope. You know, if it's not working, we can just pull it out, which sounds like a genius idea for open world. I guess
we just wouldn't have been able to make it with the team size we had otherwise. That was it.
Speaking of like, you did mention that it was going to be like a 3-4 month project initially, but then you started getting interested in it and it became a bigger project. So what kind of like things changed? What was going to happen initially? What was the plan? What mechanics, what kind of stuff would you have in the game versus how it changed later? What was added later on?
Yeah, I mean, when I say 3-4, that's what we thought at the time. I think even the version we had in our heads probably would have taken longer, because it always does, but also we were a bit naive and still quite early on in development. But the things that kind of got expanded was just like the world itself, the writing, the detail of it, the amount of characters we had. Like we had this initial idea to have masks and stuff like that, but like the city, we have a like town in our game. Like we probably would never have done that. For example, it probably would have just been ruins, and then you would occasionally meet like 1 or 2 people in the ruins, and maybe there'd be a total of like 5 or 6 characters. And now we have whole locations with like, I don't know, 20 plus characters, whatever, like up to 15, things like that. The level of detail on the art, I'd say, that was one of the things that we probably would have just done less and we did more of. And I think just the scale of the game, like the world. So like a lot of it's a desert game, but there are like two biomes at least, which probably don't really feel like desert environments. And I think that variety was really important by the end. And we actually did have a conversation towards the end about, should we make the world physically smaller and make it more dense? And I think generally that probably might be a good idea, but for us, there was like a really specific experience which we thought was important, which was that kind of like open vista and seeing these like flat dunes and nothing for a bit, and being able to accommodate that, and then something like kind of emerging in or whatever. And we tried to design the open world so that with the draw distance that we had, you would always be able to see at least one other thing. So there's always a kind of breadcrumb of like something in the distance. But we thought it was really important to have those moments of like silence or nothingness between places and give you time to just like contemplate the journey you're on.
Yeah. Something you don't feel enough with open world games is like every 10 meters there's something going on, for example, and that you don't. I feel like it's also a tricky balance of like, you don't want it to be extreme. You don't want to keep riding along on your horse or on your bike or whatever, and then nothing happens. And then other times where you just have like 10 objective markers appear. So it's like, it's a very tricky balance. And like you said, I think with open world games, that everything has to be in the game. And then that's where you'll know what the overall experience will be, because you can go to destination A or you can go to destination B first, and then that can also have create a different chain reaction if you go to some other place. What will happen in between? So that's kind of like I guess everything, it requires balance, but like you said, it's I guess it feels, the Sable feels like this game where you can just ride your bike and, like you said, see something in the distance, and that's the mood it's trying to create. So having something pop up every few seconds would have destroyed that completely, right?
Yeah. No, I think, I think the game, the landscape is very horizontal, actually. When you compare it to stuff like Breath of the Wild or even Horizon, it has this like kind of this much more vertical elements, and normally I probably would suggest pushing towards that, but then what that does is it creates a bit of like a question mark about what's hidden away and how it's hidden. Whereas for us, we were able to be quite clear without explicitly telling the player there's something here. We're able to suggest to the player there's something here, and I think that is helpful, and it's kind of in a way more similar to like Wind Waker in that way, like the sea. And we always did think about it a bit more like that. Like it's, the desert is pretty empty, and that's fine because it's a desert, and that's all built in. Like that was part of the idea. But yeah, that was really important. I think yeah. I'm trying to think what. So I guess with that element, the like horizontal, the other thing that was really useful in terms of level design were the dunes themselves. Like, so yes, it was pretty horizontal, but what the dunes themselves, the like physical movement of them undulating, the reason they were really important is because you could see something in the distance and decide I'm going to go out to it and then start the journey, but it was never a flat journey. It was never just driving straight. The dunes will always like kind of direct you and like create more of a movement, and they will always obscure things on your way. And so what that means is you can actually get a bit lost. And I think this is something I think about constantly. I think about it constantly with urban design as well as like level design is so like cities designed for people on foot are rarely on a grid, and it's fun because you can get lost. It's exciting because when you visit a city, an old city that has like winding streets and small alleyways and stuff like that, and you're trying to get to one place and you can actually see it in the distance, but you don't know how you're going to get there. Like if you try and navigate Venice, Venice is the extreme, right? But it's it's so hard to navigate without knowing.
Well, this is when I came here to England when I was 10, and I came from South America, where we have grid systems because our new cities are built for cars, right?
Yeah.
And then I came to England, I was getting lost. And this is like, I know like England's not particularly the most, London is not the most higgledy-piggledy area, but it's like getting roads that are curved, that it's not exactly like a grid. I would be lost half the time.
Just feels a lot more natural, right?
Right.
Engaging in a way, because I understand like the grid-like system in American is like, exactly, it's a 90-degree corner, it's just like you orient yourself, and maybe that's the point of it, like, so for orientation, but like in a game you might find that it's so boring at one point, right?
Yeah, And I think you need to be challenged in terms of and it's a subtle challenge. It's not like an obvious challenge. It's just something to keep you busy whilst you're exploring. But also what it gives you opportunities to do is the ultimate objective is the player sees something in the distance. They decide they want to go to it. They get on their bike. They start to head over. They lose sight of it, but then they find something else that they weren't expecting. And then they get off their bike and they get lost in that thing. And then they come out and they're like, what was I doing?
Yeah.
And then they maybe see the thing that they were going to. Oh yeah, I was going to that. And then they get back on their bike. And like that is like, yeah, like then you know, for me, that is like when you've achieved something
You've
really.
Succeeded. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's Dark Souls all the time. Every 5 minutes is Dark Souls. But then I think about other games. Yeah, like the Assassin's Creed series has been typically kind of like the biggest objective as well was, so our HUD is really relatively empty, right? Like we have this compass that you press a button, like it's not active all the time. You have to like choose to use it. And we were really deliberate about that because we really didn't want players we wanted it to be a heads up game. So you're always looking where you're going rather than looking at like a mini map or like a small, like, and we have the map itself to accommodate that, but the compass is like the kind of at the top, like the Skyrim style or Elden Ring or whatever, is like the most I would allow. Like mini maps, I cannot tell you how much I hate them.
I really like the system you guys have created with where you can place like markers. I don't remember what they were called actually in Sable, like waypoints or whatever. Or you look at it basically and you place the marker. And it just kind of it reminds me a little bit also of Metro Exodus, that you when you reached an area and you had the map on it, none of the objectives or markers or anything were on the map until you looked at them or discovered them. So if you look with your binoculars, they would be appearing like, oh, I'll mark this on my map, and you could mark. So it reminded me a little bit of that, and that just feels like so much better than it already existing on the map, and then you go because you saw it on the HUD rather than you go because you actually saw it as a play and then you marked it on the HUD. And that it feels like a more player oriented, and
it's very diegetic as well, right?
Yeah, very
because it's like it's going to be here. This is like you get your pencil out and you're like, yeah, I've actually seen it, and that's where it is compared to like some magic God knows where everything is, or Google Maps does it.
Yeah, or I downloaded it to my iPad or whatever. Like, but I think I still like maps. Like I think there's something really cool with when in a game you look at a map and there's no marker on it, but you actually look at it and you're like, oh, there's a kind of square here that looks curious. I'm going to place a marker and I'm going to go, and that's player driven. That's completely player driven, and that's the moment. Like that's great. That's so cool. Like that is
becomes problematic when the map is abstract and it only gives you the direction to go, but you don't see anything on the map. And I'm guessing it's very difficult to make a one-on-one comparison, like representation of the world on the map as well, because the world keeps getting built all the time in development, and then you have to do the same thing with the map, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, we actually did manage to do a lot of that with we had Oscar who did a game called Bad North and Townscaper. He did our map generation because he actually worked on The Division. I think he did the maps for them. So we were like, Oscar, would you like to come and make our map generation system? And he was there. So we did actually manage to get that, but it was interesting because it was a conversation about like maps, and because there's something quite interesting about having an unreliable map, right? Like that you can play with, or you can communicate world building. You could have things on the map that are no longer there. Like that's kind of interesting. Things that you can play with, or even just distances. You've got like so a game like Shadow of the Colossus, right? The map in that is you can always see where you are in it, but it's not very detailed. It's quite illustrative, and it's like, oh, it's kind of like the old Lord of the Rings maps you'd see, like here be mountains sort of thing. And it's just very like image based. I think they're a really interesting design thing. And I mean, the actually, in a way, the easiest solution is to like computer generate like a CAD, like exact millimeter to millimeter like replica, because you press a button and you bake it. Otherwise, you have to draw
you
it.
can
by
scan
hand.
it basically, like, and make the actual map, and then just present it as a map.
Yeah, and then
the irony of making a map, a one-to-one map, is that you've remade the world. You know.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's not to say that's easy. Like I couldn't do it. I don't know how to do it, but there's all these trade-offs. But on a production level, if it's that thing that I was saying about like voice acting, right? If you have voice acting in your game, if you want to make a change, it's a lot of processes, it's a lot of steps to get that one line changed. You have to rewrite it, get it re-recorded, get that re-implemented, whatever. And the same would be true if you change your map. So if you change like the location and then you have to redraw that by hand, it's actually a lot of work. Whereas if it's, we move this thing and then I run the process to rescan the map.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And then you don't have to remember it either, because you might forget if you,
Just make sure to click that button before release, and then you will get, like, if you have a system for it, then, but basically systems and tools save you a lot of development work. You don't want, like I said, you don't want to have an artist to redraw the map and redraw that area. And then, like you said, if you forget about it, what happens? The map is going to be an old version of it. So.
Yeah, but then I think you can do more playful stuff maybe if you draw it yourself. Like I was saying, you can play with the reliability, and there's a lot of fun you can have with it. Like, it's a tricky one. It's there's so like, it's such a small decision in a way to the player, but like you're fretting about it, and there's so many trade-offs and production trade-offs and design trade-offs. And
since we're speaking about decisions and trade-offs, is there something like, do you remember like difficulties you faced in the development of Sable that still popping into your mind and you wish you like did them differently? Can you share anything like that with us?
There's a lot of difficulties, but I mean, the biggest one was just making an open world game like at this scale. It was a bit of a stupid thing to do.
It's come out well. I mean, it's like maybe stupid going in, but it's come out great coming out, right?
Yeah, I think it was exhausting, and I mean, it has come out well, but it's been really difficult to like, getting performance, getting bugs, like testing it, because it's not just like you're adding, and a lot more experienced game developers will fully understand what I mean by this, but it's not adding the thing, adding a feature, adding a location is the easiest part. It's the easiest part, because it's then what the back, like what that then creates in terms of work for yourself, but for other people, because it's getting it finalized, it's testing it, it's iterating the design, but then it's also, what does this add for sound? What does this add for music? And then it's testing, it's QA, and then it's bug fixing, and you're just like it stacks. So then you add,
just like so,
so if you add if you have one location and it took you 2 weeks to make, and then another 4 weeks to get it in the game tested, final bug fix, sound, everything else. You had another location, it takes you another 2 weeks to make. Okay, it cost you 4 weeks, but then it's added another 4 weeks to back at that on the project. So you're talking, and that stuff's really hard to predict. And that's the sort of thing that when you make a game this big, the testing's really hard, because you're trying to you make a change, you fix something, and then you need a QA to go through and test the whole game, like try and test it again sometimes. And
just ship it, man. Just ship it.
Yeah.
They'll tell you about the bugs within a minute of what you would have taken you weeks to do.
Oh yeah, when you ship it, yeah.
How was the reception? Well, I mean, this is something that came up from an idea that you had, that there was a passion project. Years later, you get to the day that you press, publish on Steam, or whatever the mechanic was. Yeah. Did it feel like going out into the wide world, like into silence and waiting for people to say anything, or how was that? How was that feeling?
So I think the difficult thing with release, so we've done games before, so luckily we had some experience of this, but it's exhausting. It's really just like the most emotionally draining experience you can have. I feel like it's like adrenaline, and then you're, and I felt this when we announced the project, right? Like you get so pumped up with like adrenaline, and you do the announcement or whatever, and then that lasts like another 15 minutes, an hour or whatever, and then it all just leaves your body. And like chemically, you enter a kind of like depression, right? Like you're just like, I'm just sad. Like I'm just sad. And like after we announced the game, I felt like that, and I just went to bed. I was just like, I know this is chemical. I just have to go to bed. Like, but with release, kind of a bit more wary of that, and so you're a bit more tempered. And yeah, start seeing reviews. The first review I saw was one of the worst ones we got, so that was that set my expectations. But then, you know, we started getting better ones, and they're like the 93 from PC Gamer was a real highlight. And I think I stand by 100% of the creative decisions we made, actually, just in broad terms. I feel like those were really successful, and if you don't get on with them, then I'm totally cool with that. I think the things that were just hard were like the more technical issues, and the things that and that's the most difficult feedback.
The things that you could have fixed, right? You're like, God, I mean, it's you could have fixed if you had more time. And sometimes you have to just release, right? So
yeah, or it's not even the things that maybe you could have fixed it, but it's just like I know you're telling me this, and you're Chris.
I like how when people go online and they're like, oh, what, you know, they should have done this design decision better, and it's like, it's not like we didn't think about it. It's like people think, developers don't think of all these possibilities, but you work on something for years, you've thought of literally all the possibilities, all the bugs that you could get, everything is in your mind. It's just obviously it's decisions, and you make the decisions, and you just live with them in the end. But it's always people suggesting something, or like finding something, and the thing is like that's the first, they're the first to think about it, right?
Yeah, and those things are, you know, that comes with the territory. You just kind of, you know, when I was at architecture school, we used to have like these crits, and I learned a lot about taking public criticism from those crits, from the tutors and stuff. They would get quite nasty, to be honest.
Wow. Was that on purpose to get you like ready for it, or do you think they were just nasty?
I guess both. But no, I mean, look, you learn a lot by going through that. They're not really doing that anymore, actually. Especially on my course, they had like articles written about them. But there are all sorts of stories, like incredible stories about this stuff. But it taught me. I remember the first year, really, like first year and a half, like always going in with this like incredibly defensive like mindset, and just being like, no, I just have to be determined and like argue my point or whatever. And then something just, I had a really bad crit where I had no sleep, 2 shots of espresso before going in, and I had 9 tutors critting me, and it went very badly. And after that, I learned my lesson. You stand and you nod your head, and you accept everything they're saying. And you just say, you're right, and then you process it later. You worry about it later, and that really helped dealing with like some of this stuff as well. I mean, but no, I think all the positive criticism was feedback was really, really good. It felt really nice to see people get on with it, and I think in a way that we hoped they would, and I think that was really cool. And I think overwhelmingly it has been mostly positive, and the negative side, we did kind of expect parts of that, and it's fine. Like, you know, you can't please everyone, and that we knew that. We really knew that. And I think you know, it's okay. I think if you somehow have, then you're probably somehow doing something wrong. And yeah, I think that was just, it was just exciting, and just had a bit of a whiskey and enjoyed watching the reviews come in, really. But it was sad because we were all remote, and you know, it was kind of like yeah, it would have been really nice to, we were all like talking like, yeah, we're going to get everyone over to London or whatever and like have a party or whatever. And instead you're on Zoom with, you know, in your living room, and it's a bit sad, but because we had such a great team. Like I really feel like the team we had on this project was special as well. And there was a really great dynamic. But yeah, I think it's just, it's one of those things you have to prepare for. And the hardest thing actually, I think, as an indie developer is, especially if you haven't done it before, is that you have to keep working on this thing. You have to keep going. You have to keep updating stuff. It's not just done. And if you release and you expect that it's just done, you're in for a bad time, because you're gonna have like push yourself physically, which we did, but also psychologically into a place where getting yourself back up and running and ready to go and fix these bugs and look at this bloody Unity project again. It's hard. So yeah,
because you sort of like expect to get this release when you release the game, and then obviously you want to move on to the next project. You might have ideas, or you may already have started on the next project, but at the same time you have to go back to the other project. You're like, hey, I've been working on this for 4 years. I'm kind of like done with this.
And the thing is that, and that's something that you can't outsource or offload, because that's even going to be like a much more expensive ramp up for something else. Like if you said like, okay, so this bug, we'll outsource it to some team to go and fix them, but they're not going to know the ins and outs of
by the time you get them on board and you tell them whatever, like you probably could have done it yourself.
But then again,
that was really hard with COVID, with the pandemic, actually, when we shifted, because the two guys that we had in the office, we expected and had a setup that we were working together, and you can hand off these 15-minute tasks quite easily in the office, because it's just like turn around and be like, do you mind just taking this for now, because I've got this meeting now or whatever. And it forced us to formalize a lot more, but it also meant it put a lot of pressure on us in terms of like, well, we can't actually, we don't have the processes or setup to offload a lot of this stuff. So what ended up happening was and you don't have the physical separation anymore of like home and work. So just end up completely overworking and
that's not good, man.
That's the reality of it. I mean, I don't, I think the other reality is that we probably should have just made it smaller, but yeah, I don't know. We also just wanted to get.
Do you think Sable would have been the same game if it was smaller though?
Well, that's the difficulty, and like I said, we did talk about making it physically smaller, but we felt like it would have impacted the actual experience quite significantly. There are so many lessons that we learned just making the game, and it was our first kind of game like this scale, and the other games we've done were learning experiences, but this was just this is a totally different. Are you
planning to do any talks, Greg, for like the lessons that you've learned, maybe like from your
well, I'm doing a talk.
That's interesting.
I'm doing a talk at GDC in like 3 weeks, two weeks. It's a half an hour talk about the art of Sable. Actually, I'm going to talk about limitations and world building, and at the moment I'm struggling to get it down to half an hour. I did a like early version, and it ended up being an hour, and I kind of like was like, oh, I'm not going to do an hour because I can't fill an hour, and now I'm like, how am I going to get this down to half an hour? But
it's like editing. You're going to have to cut it down.
Yeah, it's just hard. It's hard to know. Well, anyway, I always see myself as more of a designer, but I think this is an art talk, but it's kind of looped into world building, and I kind of end up doing a bit of all of those processes, right? So it's
well, it's going to be a good time, because by the time this episode releases, it'll be right on GDC. So if you are out there, they'll be able to see in the vault, or if you're going to GDC, hopefully they'll see you. And
no, please do, please. It would be nice to have more than 3 people in the hall.
Are you doing it? Are you actually going to be in GDC?
Yeah, I'll be out there.
Well, guess what? When this episode releases, I'll be in the hall there. So you got you got one audience member at least. COVID, notwithstanding.
Yeah.
On that note, it would be great if people want to get hold of you, Greg. They can follow the wonderful Twitter. Follow you on Twitter, I presume, because that's where a lot of the stuff has come from this, right?
Yeah. Twitter's the place, really.
Fantastic. I'll put your Twitter handle in the description, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. I'm going to go back and play Sable now that my brain is working a little bit better than it has been for the last week.
Yes, thank you so much for talking to us, Greg. It's actually really nice to talk to someone who, like, you're the director of Shedworks. You can give us all the details as much as you want, and it's nice to hear all these details from indie development, because you don't usually get to hear the ins and outs in this much detail, and it's been great to talk to you.
No, thank you for having me, and it's been great to talk, and ramble for hours about.
I'll bring my microphone to GDC and we'll have a longer chat.
That's a great idea. Yes.
Uncut.
Part 2.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you. Bye. Everybody.
Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Level Design Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter via @LevelDesignFM or email us at show@leveldesign.fm. Our hosts are Mark Drew, Jonathan Wilson, Valentina Chrysostomou, and Rob McLaughlin. Editing was by Matthew Lever, and the production was by Anna Tumurova. Our theme tune is by the awesome James Elsey. This has been a Command Studios production.